Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin can and string, I'd like to bring in our analyst and co-host. He is a Vikings blogger for numerous blogs around the internet. He is a useful human, as well as a contributor to thedailynorseman.com. Please welcome Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm just really glad the useful human appellation has survived multiple episodes. That's just really great news for me every time I hear it.
At this point, I'm just a follower, and I realize that I've followed Dusty into several terrible life choices, but I feel like this one's just going to stick and be okay.
That's fair.
Of all the things I've followed that Dusty has suggested, this is probably the least harmful.
Probably.
I'd have to write some of these down, and I don't want to do a personal inventory like that until I reach at least step 3. So we're just not going to touch that. Norse Code is listener supported. We'd like to thank everyone who listened to our last show. As it turns out, that was the most listens we've ever had during the first day release of an episode. So thank you for that. That was very awesome. Also, as a result, that is our second most listened to show. Somehow, Luke Inman has both the first and the third place episode now. Luke Inman has a posse.
He has a posse. I don't want to insult Luke because he's obviously a great guest to have on the show, but I am still not sure how that happened.
How he became such a great guest on the show, or how he has the most listens to for
the most listens.
Okay.
Obviously, Luke has this natural talent to talk. He's such a great talker.
And you guys have a new podcast, You, Him, and Andy. Is that correct?
Yeah. The Andy, Luke, and Reef football machine. But that's for another time. Let's. We have a guest, I think, right?
We do have a guest. Before we get started, if you hear value in what you got here, if you would like to help donate to Norse Code, you can do so in one of two ways. You can do so at patreon.com/Norse Code. You can also go through PayPal if you'd like. Our website currently has a bad attitude and no hustle, so Dusty's working on it. It's been taken offline for just a little bit, but until then, you can access the PayPal link at paypal.me/Norse Code. Patreon is obviously more of a NPR approach, NPR fundraiser, so $1 or $2 every month ends up helping out the show quite a bit. We've certainly appreciated it over the last year, so anything you're willing to throw our way, whether it's 50 cents or whether it's tree fitty and just trying to keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay, we will be glad to help. We'll be glad to take that from you. But we have a special guest to bring on right now. He is a fantasy football writer and editor for NFL.com, as well as thebackyardbanter.com, and he is a dog picture enthusiast. Please welcome Matt Harmon. Matt, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, guys, and it's really good to know that I only have to live up to the useful human standard here, because that sets the bar, I think, at a reasonable level for me. Normally,
we're all about setting reasonable bars here.
Mm-hmm. If I had to get to something like good human or great human, I would be worried. But useful, I can handle that. So yeah, but thank you guys for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Useful human is about the highest honor that we bestow on Norse codes. So I'm trying to think of the lowest one we've ever, besides Packers fan. What's the lowest one we've ever given out?
It's justice. That's the lowest.
I can get behind that. I'm hoping to fall somewhere between useful and justice.
All right, so there's a couple of interesting things that we can talk about when it comes to Matt. Obviously, he's employed by NFL.com to be a fantasy football writer and editor, and we'll talk a little bit about that. He has an adorable dog named Charlie. We'll talk a little bit about that. But the thing I think most associated with your brand, Matt, is the reception perception project that you've started. I think this is sort of the third year, but really sort of the second full year that you've had it. And it started actually with someone that Vikings fans are very familiar with, Cordero Patterson. Right. That one, I mean, that's kind of what a trial run is for, to make sure that you can figure out everything you have. But tell us, before we get into what your Patterson take was, like 2.5 years ago or whatever. Let's just talk about how reception perception started. I know that for you, finding something that you could do that didn't exist in the world before was a big part of how you wanted to get started writing. But why reception perception? What incepted the idea, basically, for you to have this process?
Right, and actually, I'm really excited to talk about that Patterson take because nobody's ever asked me about it, which is kind of good because so everybody's forgotten about it at this point.
It's all Allen Robinson. That's all we care about.
Yeah, right. Everybody only remembers 2 years ago or like a year or so back, so that's nice. But I guess the thing with reception perception, like the wide receiver position has always spoken to me in general, I think because like the individual one-on-one matchup just feels very poetic between the wide receiver and the cornerback, and the way that some of these guys are so, to be blunt about it, like egotistical and abrasive on the field, I think that just jives really well with how I how I'm entertained, how I like to view the game of football. So I've always
That's
really
why we
had
call you Hollywood Harmon.
Exactly. The ego is well established. But I think that, so that's always really spoken to me just in that sense. But also I think that the wide receiver position is just so incredibly anecdotally analyzed because, you hear things like on the broadcast tape or whatever, when you watch the game on Sunday, like, oh, well, this wide receiver is just not getting open, or the quarterback's got nowhere to go, the receivers aren't getting open, or on the other hand, this guy's always open, but he doesn't have the quarterback to get him the ball. I really wanted to go in and, extensively go through every route and put kind of a quantitative percentage on, what they were really doing on the football field, because I think that is something that people really crave. You can read a 3,000 word scouting report that tells you, well, he gets open a lot, or he's a good route runner. I wanted to give really easy to digest information. Nothing like, it's nothing fancy. It's not a big confusing analytics system. It's just a really good representation of, like, this is what they're doing, this is what they're doing well, and this is how often they're doing it. And when you start lining it up, year over year data, and even just comparing the players, you really start to get a picture of who the wide receiver is and how they compare to others that play the position.
Yeah, so one of the great things about reception perception that you hit on was that it takes a lot of time for you, but to the reader or to the person who's looking at the data, that you present the data in a way that you can kind of instantly process. Now, of course, you kind of sometimes want, other receivers or you want another way to look at the data to get like a context for it. But, I know, for example, that Odell Beckham runs 9 routes, like 25% of the time. And he gets open on, 80% of those, which, and I'm just using, ballpark numbers, but that seems actually to fit Odell Beckham. And that gives us like an idea of, not just how a receiver is used, but how well he's used. And then you've got like further levels of data, like, well, when he's doubled, he does this. When he's in press, he has this level of effectiveness. Against zone or man, he has this kind of level of effectiveness. And it's a lot of data to have at once. And you've been able to present it really well. You've got a picture of a route tree and you've got the percentages next to it. But in terms of being able to compare it to other receivers, or in terms of getting a picture of a receiver, what were the challenges that you had when you had all this data and you needed to find a way to communicate it effectively to other people?
Well, I think the funny part is like I really haven't changed the way I've presented it too much. Like those route tree charts have pretty much been the ones that I've used from the beginning, other than I altered the colors because that's something that I'm not good at, is like apparently color scheming, which is weird because I feel like I'm a fashionable person. But I don't know. So that's really been the one. It's kind of been static in that way. Really what's just been helpful, and this kind of bleeds into that Patterson take, is just having more data, having more, guys to sample from. And I think being able to present things as like an above average, like above expectations or below expectations league wide, I think that's been really the game changing part. Like by the end of the charting period last off season, I could really tell you, well, Allen Robinson is going to be really good because he runs all of these wide variety of routes, and especially ones that quarterbacks really like to throw to, he gets open on those so easily. He's going to be heavily targeted. So being able to have, like, again, putting those things into context with what other receivers are doing and being able to say, well, this guy's getting open at an rate of NFL stars, like, you can expect a big breakout from him. That has probably been the biggest game changer. So it's like with anything, it gets better with time.
Yeah, well, actually, let's talk about the Patterson bit. It maybe luckily for you didn't get as much traction as the Allen Robinson bit, as even like some of the other charts that you've had, on Antonio Brown and Odell Beckham. But it was kind of your first foray into using this process. After you were done charting Patterson, sort of what were your thoughts, and how can you change, or what has, having 2 years of experience changed about those thoughts?
Yeah, so with when reception perception started was in the 2013 offseason. So, the year leading into I'm kind of losing track here now. The 2014, like, you lead from 2013 to 2014, right, that off season. So really, like, a lot of the work that was going on was like me refining the process. Like, before I ever, because right now I use 8 game sample sizes to put these things together, which saves me time. Like, I'm one, I'm not PFF. I don't have like a group of, God only knows how many charters they have to do all this stuff. Like, it's just me over here, and I would like to have some sort of social life, so I do 8 game samples. But really, why I did that was not just to save time, but also because that's when I found that the data was normalizing. When okay, once you get to this point in the season, things don't really change that much unless there's some kind of like egregious outlier, a game in there somewhere. So really, that was what I was doing there. And so a lot of what was going on was not being presented like publicly. Like, I only really wrote 2 reception perception articles like prior to that 2014 season. One was on Jordy Nelson and one was on Cordero Patterson. And the problem there lied, like I said, I didn't have like a lot of average data. Like, this is what a league average player would be doing. Because now looking back on it, I can see like that the numbers for Patterson were not at all indicative of a guy that was going to break out in his second year. But that's the tenor that I took with that article, because I think inherently, and this is what reception perception works to eliminate in my mind, and something that it helps me do, is not overrate like flashes of things, not overstate the spectacular or the super negative. It kind of gives me a very balanced view of what the player does on a route to route basis. But I think because I didn't have like average data or anything to compare Patterson to other than Jordy Nelson, in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, these numbers aren't matching up. Of course they're not matching up. He's Jordy Nelson. So just because he's this many percentage points behind him doesn't mean like that's not that big of a deal. So I didn't know, I wasn't properly weighting the data. So really, I think, like I said, I've gone back because a part of me was like, okay, well, why did Cordero Patterson not work? And now, obviously, like 2 years later, but even a year later, I could look back on it and be like, of course not, you idiot. Like, those numbers don't bear out. Like, you wouldn't call those were like Devontae Adams numbers now, and like everybody knows how pessimistic I was about Adams coming into this year. So I think it really is just time and nuance makes your process better, more experience doing it, and I think so. That's probably. I've never, and this is, like I said, this is really good because I've never said this publicly. I mean, I realize it now, but that's really what happened with Patterson is just, there just was not enough reception perception data, and I probably tried to jump the gun in order to popularize the series because, like you mentioned, nobody remembers that because at that time, I mean, and I still am nobody, but back then, I had like less than 1,000 followers. I was just writing for myself. I hadn't even started at Football Guys when I put that article out, so. Yeah, I mean, nobody remembers that because nobody was following me then. I was probably trying to jump the gun to popularize the series, call a breakout before it happened, and now I know how to better do or to not do those things.
That totally makes sense. And what's really interesting about that is that there was nothing wrong about the data. It was only just an issue of interpretation based off of your experience and based off of sort of the available data that you had. And that makes perfect sense. But that kind of leads us into sort of our next question. And I know you published like an article that did this for you, but really quickly, who were, sort of your biggest hits and misses in terms of identifying breakouts or things that weren't obvious? Like obviously identifying Jordy Nelson as good. I mean, that's not really a hit, but trying to identify sort of like the next receiver that you should like invest in for your fantasy team or whatever. What are your sort of biggest hits and misses?
Well, Allen Robinson is obviously the biggest hit. I mean, that's what everybody that knows reception perception knows Allen Robinson, and he
seems to know it too. Actually,
yeah, he does. We go back and forth in the DMs sometimes. He's aware of me, which is pretty cool. That actually happened like right at the end of the season, and I was like, "This is literally the best exclamation point that could have possibly happened."
Nice.
He like DM'd me and said like, "Man, thanks for all the support." I was like, "Dude, get out of here! Like, I have a job because of you, probably. So I'm not gonna take any thanks from you, pal." But yeah. So that's the biggest one, I would say. I mean, the article was literally entitled "Allen Robinson's going to have a massive breakout this season," and he had 14 touchdowns. It was a top 5 fantasy receiver. So I mean, that was the big one. One that I'm actually really proud of, and that I don't think a lot of people really remember, was during the 2014 season, I put out an article about Odell Beckham before his game against the Cowboys, where he had the one catch and then went on to tear apart the league. And probably a lot of people don't remember this is because those articles are behind the paywall at Football Guys. And again, this was a little bit before, like I said, things started picking up with reception perception. You could see his numbers were like absolutely fantastic. I mean, even before he, like I said, before the catch game, before he tore apart the league, just when he started getting playing time, he was getting open at such a ridiculous pace. And so I think that's, again, something that indicates that this player is going to produce statistically, is because he's getting open so often. So I think he was a big hit that I'm proud of. And Devontae Adams not being good on the same token was a big one. It was, and it's funny now, like, I mean, everybody this season and even now this offseason in the dynasty community and fantasy football, like everybody lines up to take punches at Devontae Adams. But it was tough being a Devontae Adams like not believer this past.
At the time you'd be a truther, right? Because you were in the minority. Jordy Nelson just went down. He had some, according to a lot of people, some pretty good tape in college, and he got some play, I think, at the end of the previous season that some people were pretty optimistic about. So you were basically a truther because you were in the minority, and there was a huge opportunity opening up for him.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Like he's exactly the kind of case that I think reception perception so useful to like have people pump the brakes on, because he had two, like I talked about overrating the spectacular and overrating like what everybody sees. He had these two big games in public, that were in grand public eye against the Cowboys in the playoffs and against New England in a primetime game against you Packers, New England. Everybody's going to be watching that. So that's what people remembered about his rookie season. But then when you watched him and I charted him on a route to route basis, this was a guy that just wasn't executing. And what I was saying was like, if they ask too much of him, like it's going to be bad. And that was even before Nelson went down. I was already like, he was like an eighth round pick in fantasy. Like, and I was saying then, like, that's too high. Like, for one, there's no available targets in the Green Bay offense. So, and then when that argument went down, when Nelson got hurt and then all these targets opened up, it was even more of like a firestorm. People started taking Devontae Adams in like the 4th round and were like, nope, well, it's a receiver with Aaron Rodgers. That's all you need to know. And I was like, that is not all you need to know. And sure enough, it was bad. So, I mean, those are some big ones. And Michael Crabtree's probably the other.
We were both on the Michael Crabtree train. I remember that. Yeah. Yeah,
and that was a lonely train, man. I mean, there was nobody really expected Crabtree even be like a useful NFL receiver again, much less.
Yeah, he was entering maybe a subpar situation because he wasn't going to be the number one receiver finally, and yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, his numbers again, like that's probably what I think. Like people ask me, like, so what's like, with any process, it's like, what's the point? What can we use this for? How can we benefit from this? That was a perfect example of a guy illustrating a player that just did not fit with the offense the offense and the quarterback that he was playing with in San Francisco, and clearly needed a change. But a guy that was getting open and running great routes and consistently executing his assignments, but his quarterback's a see it, throw it quarterback, and he has the perfect see it, throw it receiver on the other side with Anquan Bolden. Colin Kaepernick's doesn't have the anticipation, the timing to, like, all right, I'm going to hit Crabtree right at the perfect break point. That's why we talk about being on the same train. I was really hoping that Crabtree would sign in Minnesota. I thought that would be a perfect fit. Obviously, it didn't work out. Me. Yeah. Well, we all don't get what we want. But yeah, so those are probably some of the bigger hits from the last couple of years.
So who did you screw up on the most then? You're pretty open at the second half.
Yeah, for sure. You can ask me. Andre Johnson's a big screw up, which I think that's probably a hole in my process, is that I'm not going to be good about being able to be like, this guy could fall off the cliff age-wise. I was really expecting him to repeat what were really good reception perception numbers in Houston last year. And so then in my head, I'm like, oh, well, he just needs a new quarterback. Then he gets one of the best young quarterbacks in the league. I take that next logical leap. But you could see, like, right away that was not going to happen. So that's a big one. Brian Quick was also kind of, I don't even know what to say about Brian Quick, though. Because I thought, well, yeah, his reception perception was really fantastic that first, like, stretch he had during the 2014 season before he got before he banged up his shoulder, and it wasn't, that's such a weird situation. So I don't even know, honestly, I don't even know what to say about Brian Quick. Like, he might still be good, but we might never ever know because it's such a disastrous offensive situation. So that's a pretty big one. Brandon Cooks, I don't know if I want to call Brandon Cooks a miss.
I wouldn't call him a miss.
Okay.
Call him a miss.
Well, if you say so.
Yeah, I like him, but
I like Cooks, and his numbers weren't good. His reception perception numbers weren't good in 2014, but I think that I also think that my point with him was that Cooks is not a bad player, but he's not. You can't ask him to, like, there were people in the dynasty community that were like, oh, this is the next Antonio Brown. Like, you should straight up trade Antonio Brown for Brandon Cooks in the dynasty league, and I'm like, that's insanity. Don't do that. I didn't think he would hold up as the Saints, sole number one receiver, and I think that kind of bore itself out. Like, early in the season when they were asking him to be that guy, he wasn't productive at all.
And then they cycled through targets to who that number one guy would be, Snead and then Watson.
Yeah.
Snead,
I love Snead. I love Willie Snead. He's good. He's good.
Well, actually, so you talked about sort of trying to figure out when an opportunity opens up, whether or not, a particular receiver can take advantage of it. And I don't know if you've done sort of the legwork for this, but we can skip to, we've got like this mailbag here, some show notes. We can skip to actually to the bottom question here because it relates to basically the Devontae Adams situation with the Martavis Bryant year-long suspension. So who benefits? So the question comes from Brett Porter on Twitter. Who benefits more from the Martavis Bryant suspension, Antonio Brown or Ladarius Green? And then let's expand that also to include Sammy Coates and Marcus Wheaton. So who do you think, fantasy-wise, benefits from the suspension?
Well, I don't really know how Antonio Brown could benefit. He pushed
2,000 yards season, obviously.
Yeah, right. We pushed like 200 targets last year. Is he going to get 250 targets or something like that? I don't know. But I don't doubt Antonio Brown at all to do anything. He's tremendous. But looking at some of those other guys, you definitely have to think that the Ladarius Green move was in response to them knowing that before we did. Right. So I do think he will have a lot of potential to use his size and speed in the seam in ways that they haven't really had at the tight end position before. But then looking at the other two receivers, and I'll start with Sammy Coates because I think that this is something that reception perception can be helpful with. And as a disclaimer, obviously I have all the data on college prospects this year, but that's because this year I work for the NFL. I have much more access to the film to be able to chart these games. Last year, when I was just a part-time writer with a few websites, I was just scrounging around and was able to collect up a few games. I got 2 games of Coates in there, and I think that he and Bryant get labeled as similar players, but I really don't think they're similar at all. It's just
that's interesting.
Yeah, well, it's because they're big, they're fast. But I think that Bryant has always been a little more nuanced than people give him credit for. I also think that he is very natural at tracking the ball. That's something that Coates is not good at. I mean, if you just look at their success rate versus coverage on 9 routes, just straight up vertical routes down the field, and again, with Coates, it's a smaller sample size, but Bryant's clearly better. I mean, that's what he has, that more of an innate trump card in that way that Coates does. And maybe Coates develops that way. I think Coates would be much better in ways that you do see them use Martavis, which would be in like this, this just on slant routes or on, and they really tried late last year to get him like screen passes, have him break yards after the catch, break tackles in the short area of the field. I think Coates, if he's going to be really useful to them, I think that would actually be better than just as a straight shot player. And then Marcus Wheaton, I mean, I think he gets I do think he gets a benefit. It's been such a weird NFL career for Marcus Wheaton. And hypothetically, you would think that he and Roethlisberger should be on the same page, but he just he hasn't been able to routinely defeat top coverage, and he still is not going to get top coverage, but you saw him, produce much better when he was the third option in the passing game. You saw him get more favorable matchups, and now when he gets bumped up again in the pecking order, I don't know, that's where he struggled early last season. So quite honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Pittsburgh, again, re-ups at the wide receiver position, because whatever they say about Bryant, and it's good that they want to support him. I think he clearly needs that. Mm-hmm. But this is their strength. If Pittsburgh is going to be good, they should continue to strengthen their strength. And it wouldn't surprise me to see them sink another early pick into a wide receiver.
I mean, you'd probably lose it if they went for Sterling Shepard.
To be honest, I'm a little bit obsessed with the idea of Corey Coleman there.
Oh, that would be a lot of fun. That would move Coates completely out of consideration.
Exactly, which I don't think is a bad thing. I'm not a big fan at all, to be honest with you.
Well, we've got a lot of questions. I actually don't know how much time we have as a host. I should probably ask you those things.
But I don't care. We can go as long as you want.
Well, you got to be careful about that. Once we had a show run 6 hours, we're not going to do that. Don't worry.
Okay,
but I'm just saying you got to be careful about the kind of leeway you give us. So, we've got a lot of Vikings questions. It's a Vikings podcast. Let's start. And I'm going to jump around on these show notes a little bit just to see if we could fit the flow of the show. But let's start talking about the current Vikings receivers. Now, I know you did some reception perception at different points in time for Patterson and Charles Johnson and Stephon Diggs. Although I don't think you got a full sample for Diggs. But based
I'm not fully done with him yet.
Yeah. But based off of what you have done, we can take a look at Tommy the Gun 13, Tommy Gunn's question, with wide receivers Diggs, Thielen, Wright, Johnson, Patterson, and Isaac Fricke, who I'm sure you're an expert on. How comfortable are you not drafting a wide receiver until the 5th round again?
Well, it's funny because you talk about my misses earlier, and one of them that we didn't talk about was ironic because this is a Vikings show is Charles Johnson, which because I thought that I liked him a lot coming into this year, especially for fantasy. Where he was going, I thought he was kind of a good value pick. I also didn't expect you guys to attempt 20 passes a game or whatever you did, but I liked Johnson. I thought that he was a really good vertical threat for them in the 2014 season. I thought he legitimately played well. I thought his reception perception was not outstanding, wasn't indicative of this is a future NFL star, but a guy that could start for them, could execute, but he just completely fell out of favor. The one thing that I think perhaps bothered them, and maybe this was bore out in his reception perception, I didn't emphasize it enough, he's so bad at contested catches. He was he was in the bottom 10 percentile of guys I charted last year. I mean, just completely bad.
Looking at the data set that I have from your website, I think only one player was worse, and that was Justin Hunter. And then the only other one that's close might be Devontae Adams. Maybe.
Yeah, so you can see the kind of company that he's keeping there. Perhaps that really was what was a big problem for him. But I still found it odd that like he just completely fell off the map. I think that, so to answer the question, I wouldn't be comfortable not drafting a wide receiver until the 5th round again for the Vikings. Yeah. I think that you talk about a guy who's great at contested catches. I would love to see, well, part of me is very conflicted because, again, it's such a low volume passing offense, at least as it was constructed last offseason, that from like a dynasty perspective for fantasy, I would hate to see Josh Doxson there, but I think it's such an ideal fit. Like, right. I really do think it's what they need, and I think he could play multiple spots for them. And there's a lot of guys that I think would fit well with what Minnesota needs. So I personally, no, I would not wait until the 5th again.
Okay, well,
I think they got to open it up, man.
Yeah, no, I'm totally on board with you, both in terms of increasing the number of passing attempts and getting a wide receiver early and also late. Just get more wide receivers, man. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the draft work that you've done. You've done some extensive draft work, and I want to highlight it. But there's a couple more questions about sort of the current wide receivers, or one more question, really. So you probably were able to watch a little bit of Jarius Wright playing when you were looking at Diggs, you're looking at Charles Johnson. What spot on the depth chart would Jarius Wright be on an above-average team? And I assume, so this comes from @Iowa_Josh. I assume Josh means an above-average wide receiver core. So where do you think that Jarius Wright would fit? Just ballpark it.
I mean, I think he would be somebody you're not relying on. Ideally, I think he would be a 4. Because he can play special teams too, right? Does he do any special teams work or anything like that? Because that's always important when you talk about like a Klingon roster guy. For special teams, it's important.
He's not a 4-phase special teamer, and he doesn't return, but he is an all right special teamer when it comes to things like kickoff coverage.
Right. So yeah, I mean, he's ideally that type of guy. Like, he's fine. I mean, he's never been somebody that you're like, I'm really annoyed with what he's bringing to the table, but he's also the guy that you're never like, I never even, like, I always, sometimes, to be honest with you, when I'm looking at Minnesota's receiver core, I'm always like, oh, right, I forgot Jarius Wright's there. So he's that type of guy. He's somebody that ideally you would not necessarily want to be relying on, but if you have to, it's okay.
All right. So now we can go to the draft. You've done a bunch of work recently on the draft. You've got a couple of reception pieces. We'll link those in the show notes about some of these receivers. But let's start with all of these questions. So from Tim Clark @TimClark65DN, for Minnesota, Thompson or Doxson, Shepard or Carew. I assume that's not like either or for both of them. I assume it's like which one of these 4. And how much upside does Shepard have? So that's Michael Thomas, Josh Doxson, Sterling Shepard, and Leonte Carew. So it's a 2-part question. Which one of those 4 for Minnesota, and how much upside does Sterling Shepard have?
Well, frankly, I think that I would prefer that they go with somebody with a bit of size, and I think that there's another question that hits on this too. Like, I think that some of these guys like Carew and Shepard, as much as I do like them, I do think they would kind of be redundant with what they have with Stephon Diggs, and that's not necessarily, I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, you can build a passing offense around 2 guys with that skill set. But I think it would be nice for them to have a big guy with size. And I think that, I mean, Thomas is a very detailed route runner. He's very advanced with some of the more nuanced things he does. He's not an overwhelming athlete, but I know like Rumford Johnny compared him to Michael Crabtree, and we already talked about how we would have imagined that Crabtree would be a great fit there. So perhaps that really is an option there, you know, later in the first round that to be honest, I haven't even really considered until just now. I think those 2 would be ideal fits because they're, like I said, they're bigger, but they also can play with an anticipatory passer, which I still think Teddy Bridgewater is that type of guy. So those 2 would probably be my early favorite, just to kind of diversify your receiving core, because I think that's where when you get your receiving core to its peak is when you start to kind of add in different elements. And as far as
let's talk about that actually, because then we can just sort of, you know, dovetail into whatever direction we want. The value of diversity versus the value of, like, you know, quote unquote having talent. Like, if the Vikings are in a place where they can get a slightly better receiver with a redundant skill set to Stephon Diggs, or a receiver with not as redundant a skill set, as with a relatively unique skill set on the roster, but is maybe not as good as that first option. What additional value do you think that an offense gets from having a diversity of receivers that they would not get if they had a slightly more talented receiving core, but with a bunch of redundant skills?
I mean, I think it depends on just how redundant you're going to be. And because Minnesota is so bereft of quality options right now, like, I mean, they have Diggs and, like, all those other cats we mentioned. Like, as I said, I wouldn't want them to be, more than my 3 at best. I think that they can probably afford, and I do think that Shepard, and that's in there too, I do think that he can be, if he improves some of the parts of his game, he can be more than just a slot receiver. I think he can win outside. I'm not like there's a lot of people that have already put him as like Julian Edelman slot receiver type and left it at that. I think that there's more to him than that. I mean, and again, I've written about him before, and I'm not comparing him to Odell Beckham. I always start with that disclaimer, but the reason that Beckham got on the field early, despite missing all that time, was that he was the best route runner in that class. And I think that Shepard, regardless of how many snaps he played from the slot in college, displays that same sort of nuance and detail in his routes. And so I think that there's no for me, there's no reason to limit him to being a slot receiver, especially because he tested well in some of the jumps at the combine. That was encouraging to me. So I think that, like, if they really do think that Shepard, and which, I mean, frankly, that's what reception perception says. Like, if they're faced with, if Doxson's off the board, if Treadwell's off the board, and they're looking at Thomas versus Shepard there, I'm fine with them going Shepard, even though he's another smaller guy like Diggs. And I don't want to just like lump these guys together because of size. Right. Like, I think people do that with Tyler Lockett and Doug Baldwin in Seattle, but those guys to me have very different skill sets. So I think that there's a lot of value in different.
Wait, are Lockett and Baldwin the same size?
Well, they're both like smaller. Like,
that's interesting. Well,
five,
Baldwin
10.
doesn't play that small, so.
No, he doesn't, and that's an important part. Like you said, it matters how they play, not so much what they measure out to be. And I think that Shepard plays bigger than his size too. He's not one of the best at contested catches in this class. He is below the average there, but like I said, I do think because he showed some of that jumping ability at the combine, perhaps there is more to get out of him in that way. And that would be the way that he gets farther along that smaller receiver and, towards the Antonio Brown portion of that archetype, as opposed to like the, Stephon Diggs portion of that archetype. So to me, it's great. I think it's really important. It would be tremendous if they had a guy like Doxson that Bridgewater can throw a contested catch to and have confidence that he's going to win it. But at the same time, like, I don't think you should diversify just for the sake of diversifying, like, especially when you need options. You need more quality options. And if the guy's there that you trust more, then you go with that.
Sure. So the next question, I don't know if this was a complete question when it was tweeted out or if James copied only part of it, but it's technically a question, and so let's ask this one. So this comes from Patrick Sugart, at Patrick Sugart. What wide receivers play the biggest? I don't know, like, out of what set.
Yeah, right.
But what wide receivers play the biggest? So we just mentioned this, like, wide receivers that play big. We talk about that. Who comes to mind?
Well, I mean, you talk about who plays the biggest. Some of the big guys play the biggest. I mean, you look at if
people who are used to having size often use it. Yeah.
Right, but some guys have size and they don't know how to take advantage of it. I mean, we talked about Brian Quick earlier when he was struggling in the NFL, and even going back to his college tape, he was 6'3", 6'4", over 210 pounds, but didn't play like he understood he was that big. Right. Darunya Wilson from this draft class. Even before he ran his 4.9 40 or whatever, I think he was the lowest, or at least one of the 2 or 3 lowest, at converting contested catches in his reception perception. So there are guys that have size, and he's built like 6'5", 220 something. Like, right. He's a huge guy, but he doesn't play like he knows it. So size is only a skill if you know how to use it. And there are big guys that know how to use their size. I mean, Mike Evans is an obvious example. So he's one of the receivers that plays the biggest, but also you can play big with your intensity, with your physicality, and I think Des Bryant's a great example of that. He's a big guy. He's not the biggest player, but he plays that way. He plays like he's bigger than his size, even though he's already big, because he's one of the more physical, more intense players. I mean, and then you see smaller players like Steve Smith. I would say plays the biggest. But he's a little dude.
I was wondering if his name was going to come up. Yeah.
Yeah, which is why I always hate in every draft season. I think there's been less of it this year. But at the same time, I've still seen some of it. Why I hate when any draft prospect gets compared to Steve Smith, not just because he is my Lord and Savior.
Who are you a fan of growing up? What was your team?
Carolina.
Oh, weird. Keep going.
Right. I don't know. There's no correlation there. But yeah, no. I mean, yeah. So I always dislike when somebody's compared to Steve Smith, because I don't think that, like, for example, Brandon Cooks was a guy coming out who got compared to Steve Smith, and I was like, you obviously have never watched. You can't tell me honestly that you're not just talking out of the other end of yourself if you're going to make that comparison, because Brandon Cooks' big struggle is when guys get physical with him, when he has to make a contested catch to convert a deep pass, not have Drew Brees lead him perfectly on a deep pass, you know? So those type of players, I mean, Steve Smith is a great example. I mean, Beckham is another great example. I mean, if anybody coming out of the draft was Steve Smith, was Odell Beckham, because you could even see he played like a hothead even in college, and we saw this year go over the top.
A little bit this year.
Yeah, right. We saw it this year go over the top at times, but that is an advantage, and that's part of what makes him great, is because he plays. So part of playing bigger is playing kind of like a jerk, and I think that some of those guys do that. And in terms of players in this draft class, I think that Treadwell is obviously an example. He has a big frame and knows how to use it. Doxton's easy example. Like, he has it, and that's important about playing big too. Is like, you can be big all you want, but you got to have a bigger. You got to have the arms. You got to have the leaping ability. And I think that Doxton, despite not being 6'5", 230 or like a Calvin Johnson.
Yeah. I was actually about to talk about that, because Doxton's an interesting case. I think it's pretty obvious to a lot of people. Doxton plays really big. But he's 6'2", 202, 6'2", 205, right? Yeah. And like, that's, I mean, Patterson is like 6'2", 205, and you don't really think of.
You know who he always looked like to me, and I'm not making this like player comparison, but like just looking at them, he looks like Keenan Allen to me.
Right, exactly, right.
But they're not that, they don't play the same at all.
Yeah, and so Doxton, he plays humongous, frankly. And his contested catch rate is the best out of all the ones that I have on this chart in front of me, 85%. When the next best is Laquan Treadwell at 75%. So Doxson seems to be able to find the ball and get it when it's coming to him. But then, what are some of the names that aren't, one of these? I mean, because everyone talks about these four receivers like Treadwell, Coleman, Thomas, Doxson. What are some of the names of receivers that do play big that are not in those four?
Well, I think that Malcolm Mitchell is one.
And you just wrote a piece on him. We're going to link that one in the show notes.
Yeah, for sure. Mitchell's one of my favorites in this class, and but he's not big. He is built like a. Somebody made a perfect comparison to me the other day with him that I really wanted to steal, but now I can't remember it, so I guess I can't. But he's a guy who has good ball skills and is really tough, and I mean that's part of it too. Like, he doesn't have one of the top contested catch conversion rates, but it's above the class average, and I think he's a guy that does play big despite being like built like a Jeremy Maclin type of receiver in that like kind of Nelson Aguilar mode. And some other guys that play big, I would say that people don't know about as much would be Kenny Lawler. Which I was talking about this, I think, with Jeff Ridson and Derek Klassen today on Twitter. Like, when people are like, "Well, Jared Goff did it with nobody around him," I'm like, Kenny Lawler is a pretty good player. Like, he's a good receiver. I mean, he has some drops and stuff, but if you follow my work, you know how I feel about drops and everything. He's definitely a guy that he has a strong contested catch conversion rate. He has good ball skills. he needs to work a little bit on his technique and everything, but he's a guy that he's very, they come out of the same school, but he's built in that Keenan Allen type of mold too. Kyrus Garrett's weird because he is big, but he doesn't I just don't think he's another one that he has a good contested catch conversion rate. That's a skill of his, but in other ways he doesn't play big at all. He doesn't play after the catch.
Physical through the route.
Yes, physical through the route and after the catch. He gets, if you look at his numbers, he gets dropped on first contact a weird amount, considering that he's built like a Des Bryant type. I think that's who his athletically who he compares to. But to me, there's an element of after the catch, and even playing the ball in traffic too. You have to know timing and you have to know how to set defenders up, and you can even see it when you're watching him. You're oh, this is it's an open field opportunity. He should make this guy miss. He's much bigger than him, and then the smaller guy brings him down every time. And I think it's just because he just doesn't know how to set defenders up, and perhaps that's a skill he can learn. Perhaps it's not. Some of the other smaller guys that play.
There's a lot of skills he's going to have to learn coming in, right? He's
from Tulsa. He ran 2 routes. A lot of these guys don't run a full route tree and everything. Some of the other ones, some of the guys like Garrett are a little more slanted. And in that same vein, I think Corey Coleman definitely plays bigger than his size. I wrote about him for NFL.com recently and really tried to go to task on the some of the narratives that are around him, from the Baylor offense, and also
he's Steve Smith this year too, though.
Right. Right. But in a way, there are shades of that in there because he does play that's the thing. Like I said, people are oh, Coleman doesn't block, he's lazy and all that, and I think they just aren't understanding.
They don't understand the Baylor offense.
No, they don't, not at all.
Right.
And there's a lot of that out there. Where I just wish, I don't know. Is there because I know I've talked about it with Chris Brown on Twitter a few times. I don't know if he's written anything about it because it'd be great to just tweet that out.
To get a smart football thing.
Yeah, to tweet 3 times a day.
Yeah, right. I'll probably see if I can find those tweets and put them together or something, put them in the show notes, because I also had this conversation with someone who called Corey Coleman lazy, and I wrote this long scouting report where ultimately I didn't put him in the first round, which now puts me sort of in a minority. But one of the things that I definitely don't agree with is the idea that he's lazy. They run 100 plays a game, and he's there for most of them, and so Bryles doesn't ask his receivers to do things if they're not going to be in the play. They don't. He specifically tells receivers not to spend energy blocking or running routes if the play is going the other way, or they just run now screens for replay options and stuff like that.
Yeah. See him there are plenty of times when you're watching Coleman that you just see him trot down the sideline.
Yeah, it's just chills.
It's actually obnoxious to. I remember charting his games. It was very obnoxious to watch because I'd be well, I'm not going to chart that as a route, so I'm just wasting this play right now. There's no success rate versus coverage on trots down the sideline. So I think that, but when you look at Coleman, if you just look, and I think this is how you should evaluate players, is you should evaluate them based on their execution, based on their traits and their ability, not the environment that they're placed in. That's just where they are. So I think that when you look at Coleman, you judge him just for what he is. You see a very intense, engaged player. There are plenty of times, I know there's that one play, I can't remember the exact game, where he just whips a guy at the press, at the jam at the line of scrimmage, and just goes over top of him for a touchdown. And that's the sort of intensity that you see from him.
The West Virginia game.
Probably that was the best game I charted this year. That or Michael Thomas versus Rutgers were the 2 top ones.
Oh, good Lord! I looked up the DBs Michael Thomas was against. One of them was a freshman, so I kind of
some bad players.
You whipped them.
That Corey Coleman versus Baylor. You see plenty of intensity and physicality and playing big in that game, and I think that's something that is a strength of his.
Okay, so we kind of touched on this next question. It's from Daniel P. @PersonDaniel, but be good to get sort of a clearer answer. So the Vikings do miss out on Treadwell, Dox, and Thomas. So, people trade up ahead of them. They go, whatever, right? Maybe like one of them is secretly is a character red flag. Who should they target later on whose skill set, wouldn't be redundant with the ones that they have on the roster?
Well, I think we talked about some of the bigger receivers there. Michael Thomas, the Southern Mississippi Michael Thomas, the curious case
right.
of the
non-combine invite. Yeah,
it's still so weird to me, and I do not have any inside information on that one.
What have you been doing at NFL.com? Not trying to find this out.
I know. I don't even know who doles out the combine invites, but it's not me because that guy should have been at the combine. He's a guy that I think would be a good late rounder for them. I think, to be honest with you, it gets tough in this class. There is somebody was apparently digging up old Corey Davis tweets, who's one of the Western Michigan guys who did not declare this year. And he's like a bigger 6'3", 220 type of guy who I charted, which this was really frustrating. I charted a few games from him and I was like, oh, this guy's definitely going to declare. I'll go ahead and start looking at him back in November. And then he went back to school and I was like, oh, damn. But that's wasted data for this year. But my point is there's a lack of big X receiver types in this class. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of slots and flankers, which is why I think a guy like Keiris Garrett is very interesting because he's one of the few sleeper types. Marquez North from Tennessee is another one that
he's got to be interesting.
Yeah, before you ask, I don't have any reception perception on him. He had 6 catches this year.
No kidding. Yeah, right.
I set a 6-game limit for college players because referencing back to the data normalizing for around 8 for NFL because the season's shorter for college. That's where it starts to kind of even out there. 6 catches, obviously, not gonna qualify, but I have watched some of him. I remember being really intrigued with him going back to his freshman season. I remember being a guy he's a guy I was like, oh, I'll keep an eye on him. And then he just completely fell off the face of the earth. He tested well at the combine. I think he could be, and he's still very young, which I think is important. If these upside guys are young, I think that's a good sign. So those are the two obvious sleeper X types that I think could be really great for them to look at. I also think that Leonte Carew is not quite redundant with what they already have, even though he's not the biggest. I do think he's physical, he plays big, and could develop could develop into a really good route runner. And I think that's the type of receiver that Teddy Bridgewater is going to always succeed with. And I honestly wouldn't hate them just getting, again, if they're late in the draft and they're looking for just quality players, I would look at Rashard Higgins, who I'm still a huge fan of despite his god-awful combine performance.
It was pretty bad.
Oh, it was awful. It's isn't it the 3rd or 4th percentile of Spark athletes tested in the last however many years they've been doing that? I remember listening.
It was pretty bad.
Oh, it was bad. It was awful. I remember listening to Zach Whitman talk about that on the Road of his radio podcast, and he actually even mentioned him being one of my favorite, Matt Harmon's favorite players or whatever. And I remember him saying just going over how bad the combine performance was and how bad the how long the odds were that he was going to have to beat. And I was actually walking my dog at night at the time, and I remember I just stopped and audibly went, ugh. So
I just pulled up his numbers. So if you remove Darunya Wilson from which I think you kind of have to.
I'm not even sure he really showed up.
Right. He actually had, it looks like, the 3rd worst overall athletic performance of receivers at the combine. So that puts him sort of in the 5th percentile. And Spark, they calculate a little bit differently than a lot differently than I do. But yeah, it's it was a trying time for Hollywood.
Yeah, but I still think that, for now, I'm still going to trust his reception perception, which was pretty great. And I'm open to it being wrong. This is something that I struggle with in general with my process, but I think it's even more pronounced on the college level because I don't know how to adjust for strength of competition without involving somebody else's numbers. And at this point, I'm not willing to do that. But at the college level, especially, like for NFL, it's like, okay, these are all NFL defenders. Some of them are obviously better than others. But comparing like the level of competition that Laquan Treadwell is going against compared to these guys like, in the Mountain West, like some of these guys are never going to even sniff an NFL field, like even dream about it. So his outrageous numbers could be a product of just him being better than all these cats, but definitely not good enough to contribute in the NFL. But at the same time, I think that he's a guy that he can do a little bit of everything, and if he's as good as I think he is, he will at least make some sort of impact for the Vikings late.
Well, so the interesting thing, if we want to talk about Higgins real quick, athletically, is that though his combine numbers are pretty low, what do you sort of imagine, if you had to, and we're all bad at this, so just disclaimer, no one's going to hold you to this, but what would you imagine his agility or quickness scores would end up being? Because we didn't have that from the combine, and my data shows that actually for a player like Higgins, with bad speed for his weight and terrible explosiveness, and again, he had quad issues at the combine, so maybe. And I have no idea how his pro day went. His quickness issues could actually put him. His quickness could actually put him if he runs really quick in the agility drills. His quickness could actually put him in smack dab in the middle in my wide receiver combine ranking. So where would you? It's a complicated formula. But where would you think that he would score in short shuttle and 3-cone? And again, we're all bad at this, but estimate.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that would be his. I would think that would be his strength. That's what he was good at on tape, not necessarily beating guys over the top consistently or being a vertical threat. I mean, you saw him. Have great change of direction. I'm looking online too, like see if I can find any. I don't know if he's even had a pro day or what, but okay, I do see it now. But
pro day reporting is less than
whatever.
So yeah,
I'm still only seeing combine times, but that's not helpful. Anyways, so I would say that he would be at least above average in those. I mean that's what, like I said, that's the strength of his game. I have no idea like what to even ballpark the numbers at, but
we got some pro day results at NFL.com. Short shuttle 4.53, 3-cone 7.13. We ran the 40-yard dash 4.6. So that's those are numbers.
Okay. Well, it looks like it'll be another sad night writing in my diary about this.
Wow, this is the lowest wide receiver score I have. Oh, no, sorry. I forgot about Duke Williams. No, don't worry.
I'm going to leave the podcast.
No, there's so many more questions. There's not that many more questions. But we've basically already answered this question. But I want to ask it anyway because this listener kind of gets cranky. At Jay-Z Hoodie, Judd's All Gets Hoodie. If the Vikings decide to go wide receiver later in the draft, I assume, maybe they also went early in the draft. Which one would you choose? Would you choose Kairos Garrett, who you've mentioned, Marquez North, who we're kind of interested in, or Jordan Payton or Rashad Robinson? De'Runnya Wilson, also an option, but I've already crossed him out. So out of Garrett, North, Payton, and Robinson, who'd you pick?
Well, yeah, no to De'Runnya Wilson. I'm fine with that too. By Robinson, does he mean DeMarcus Robinson from Florida?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, probably DeMarcus Robinson. I just put some stuff in. Rashard is a cornerback, right?
He's a cornerback from LSU. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's okay.
That's my bad.
Same conference. Who cares? But so I do think actually that just to talk about him, because I haven't yet, and I haven't really talked about him a bunch at all. Really, he is interesting. I mean, I would have thought he would have tested better at the combine, but I also wouldn't be surprised if he's not in great shape because he seems like he's kind of a knucklehead. And maybe I'm putting it lightly when I say that, but he definitely has ability. Like he was definitely bad at times this year, but you could also see him make play. Like the best way that he scores out in reception perception is after the catch. And I think that would be an interesting option there. But that's a total risk to me. I'm not. There are people that are really high on Jordan Payton. I'm not one of them. I don't have a full reception perception sample for him. Frankly, I think I saw a couple games. Was like, that's That's all I need to see. But some people really do like him. Yeah, that was enough of that. So, I was on limited time to get all these college guys in anyway. So, North and Garrett, we mentioned them already, and I think those would be the two guys I would look at, because if you're going late in the draft, likely these guys are not going to contribute for you right away. So why not take a stab?
Take probably quite some time. So both of them are going to take quite some time. So where do you expect, Garrett and North to go? Not that, we're going to be good prognosticators, that sort of thing. Who would you like at what their probable price is going to be for a long-term project? North, maybe 7th round. Garrett, maybe 5th. I don't actually know. But who do you like for their price?
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if North ends up being like an early day 3 pick, just because he's young and he's athletic. And I think that somebody's going to talk themselves into being able to develop that. And perhaps they will. There's the injury risk could be the thing I think that pushes him down, because he just couldn't stay healthy at Tennessee. Mm-hmm. Probably for the price, I would like that. I would probably like North better. But I am really intrigued by Kieris Garrett if he's able to put it all together, because I do think that he will at least offer a vertical element right away, which I don't know how useful that is to Minnesota, but for other, yeah. Well, I don't know. It couldn't make use of elite deep threat Mike Wallace. What? No, I'm joking when I say that. But yeah, no, I said so. I think both of these guys are really intriguing. I would probably take if I'm the Vikings especially, I would probably take the stab with North in hoping that it's a sound coaching staff with a looks like you've got Mike Zimmer there for the long term. You've got a quarterback. You've got an offense that they can probably, they can have. It has good structure. They can probably nurture him into. So he would probably be the one I'd like better for the price. But I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up going ahead of Garrett.
Sure. So Tommy Gunn asks, Michael Thomas has been gaining traction. Is he a better fit for the Vikings than Treadwell?
Better fit for the. I don't know. He might be a better fit just because I do think he's, like I said, very comparable to Crabtree, who like we said earlier, would be a great fit there. He has that type of route runner, like a big receiver that knows how to run nuanced routes and get separation like a smaller receiver. So in that sense, perhaps he would be a better fit. But again, I think that Treadwell is one of the few guys up top that could be that it like profiles as the true X receiver, and I think that would be very helpful for them. So you can't go wrong with either one of them. I think maybe Michael Thomas is the better fit, but I would not, like, if it was presented between the two, I would still take Treadwell.
Fair enough. I think let's see. I think that's all the questions that we have for you from the Norse Code mailbag. But for me, real quick, let's talk about Charlie for a second. How did you acquire said dog?
It was actually a really interesting story because it was completely unplanned.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, no, it wasn't like I was not looking to get a dog. I've always loved dogs. I always wanted to get a dog. But so after college, I spent one, quite frankly, miserable year living back in the town that where the school was that I graduated. It was an abject personal failure, and I moved. So I was like, okay, I need to get out of here, but I'm gonna go. I wanted to get a job back up near DC where I'm from. So I applied to some jobs. Eventually, I got one, and I moved back in with my mom, who's living in the house that we grew up in, and we had an older dog there who actually just passed away in October. I wrote a post about her on my site if anybody's interested in reading that. And so she was 16 years old at the time, and one thing we'd always talked about, you could see when she was always really energetic for being an older dog. But one thing that we noticed was when I would have friends that would bring puppies over, it would bring more out of her. It would bring more energy. So I, had thought about that, but my mom was pretty much nah, I don't want a dog or whatever. But so I'm living at home, and at the place that I started working at, one of my coworkers there, her friends had a litter, and they took one of the dogs, but it just wasn't really working out. Like this girl that worked with me, like she worked two jobs. Her kids weren't really helping out, so she was like, I'm just gonna give the dog away. And I was like, well, I'll try it. Like, I'll try it out. Like, let me,
try this dog out.
Yeah, I'll try. I was like, well, yeah, let me bring him home and I'll see how he fits in. And actually, to be honest, and it's a good thing actually Charlie is not in the room right now, and I don't know if he likes to relive this, but when I brought him home, he was a freaking nightmare, man. Like, he was.
Oh, really?
He was a train wreck. I mean, he was 5 months old at the time, and he was not fixed. So he goes into, like I said, this is the house I grew up in. It's a really nice home. Like, my mom's doing all she can living there by herself to keep it up. And he starts marking his territory everywhere. He'd never met a female dog, so he's all up in this dog that I mentioned, Dixie, that was our family dog. Like, she's an older female, and he's like obsessed with just doing weird stuff at her. And I'm like, this. I remember saying out loud, and I was dating a girl at the time. It didn't last very long. But
at the time. Oh, okay.
I was dating a girl at the time, and I remember calling her and be like, babe, this dog has got to go. Like, I can't do this. This guy he's a nightmare, and just was terrible. So I was like, I'm going to give him back. And of course, the girl Tiffany who gave it to me was like, nope, you took him. He's yours now. And so of course I'm like, great. I don't know if I can handle this. Like, and I couldn't keep the two of them. I couldn't keep Dixie and Charlie around. But like, so I had to keep him like pent up in the bathroom, like while I was away at work, and her, I didn't want to put her away. Yeah. But then when I was home, because I had to watch the little idiot, like I had to put her upstairs in my mom's room, and I couldn't keep them together. And then finally, like, so then so that was I brought him home on a Thursday, and then so Saturday I took him to the park. We fell in love, and that was it. I mean, it was like I took him off his leash. I threw a ball with him, and then ever since then, like, I mean, he's the greatest thing in my life. And so I was like, all right, well, let's, I got him fixed, and I started really training him to, like I was like, when he would start to go towards Dixie to be all weird, I'd be like, nope, can't do that. And then obviously, like, he got his operation done. And people tell you, like, you're like, it's not going to be instant. It's not going to be instant. It really was like overnight. It was done.
Oh, wow.
And he was, and ever since then, like, looking back, it's funny for me to tell this story now, and I'm probably rambling on more than you bargained for, but
no, this is great stuff. Are you kidding me?
He's such a different dog than he was then. Like, thinking back on that little animal, he's like, it's not even funny how like different the dog that he's developed into. Like, we had a Halloween party at our apartment complex or whatever, and a lot of the other people have dogs, and you have one dog who's jumping up on everybody, you've got another one digging into the vegetable tray to lick the dip out of and like all these dogs doing all this bad stuff, and there's Charlie like just sitting perfectly by my side, and I'm like, man, I am proud of you. He's
an honor student.
I do. I have his certificate from dog training like hung up in my room. I am proud of what happened to that dog and how much his
proud that you cut its penis off. Oh, sorry, balls.
Penis off. Come on, I'm not a psychopath. So that's the story of how, like, it was completely just like, she just mentioned one day, I'm giving just this not working out with this dog, and I'm just looking to give him away. And I was like, all right, well, and I brought it up to my mom. I was like, well, we've always talked about maybe a puppy would bring some more life out of Dixie. Like, I won't be here. Like, I didn't live at the house that much longer after that. Like, I'm not going to be here that much longer, but it would be good, I think, And then, of course, like, I showed her the picture of Charlie, who has always been as cute as he is now. Right. And she's like, all right, yeah, bring him home. Right. So it was easy to convince.
So I actually missed a question here. I blame James. He put it in the wrong section. What college wide receiver traits do you feel... Sorry, moving back. What college wide receiver traits do you feel are the most and least transferable to the NFL game?
This is quite a scale back. If anybody made it through that sob story of my dog.
How about, okay, we'll just edit it so that this question ends up before this dog story.
Perfect. That sounds great. So at college wide receiver traits, I mean, one thing that you always want to look for is how they function in tight coverage, how they function against press, when guys are getting physical with them in the route. I mean, perfect example was Marquise Lee back at USC. Like, that guy did not, like, he just, not only do I think he just did not like contact, it's like he did not know how to handle guys like playing in tight coverage and guys being physical with him in route. And you can see, like, to this day, he's never, like, I don't think he's ever going to develop into anything more than just like a hopeful bit player or whatever. Yeah, so he was, just a nightmare. Like, it's just, he's one of the ones, like, when I first started like scouting receivers, just everything that he did, like, it was just, and people like you. Oh, just a complete red flag. Like, and just everything. Like, if I was for some reason running a weird class where I was teaching this stuff, like how to scout wide receivers, I would use Marquise Lee as an example, because people liked Marquise Lee. There were definitely parts of his game that people appreciated, but the red flags were just too much. And I think that, again,
so aside from, like, so there's the physicality aspect. He didn't know how to deal with physicality. Were there other red flags to you? I mean, I know you don't care about drops, but he did drop quite a few.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I mean, it's to say I don't care about drops might be a little bit of an overstate.
Absolutely do not care about drops.
But there are differences in drops, and I think that one of the things for him was, like, he just had such poor technique, and you can definitely fix that. But some of the catches that he, like, where he displayed this poor technique, were on the most difficult, like, on the catches where, this is not like a routine just on a slant route and I'm just going to hit you with this, like, but it was on plays where you don't have the time to think, you just have to react. And his reaction was always to alligator arm it, always to bring his arms not up in that, like, fully formed web. So you could see, and that was consistent. Even when he was putting up numbers at USC, he was doing that sort of stuff. So that was a red flag. Just how, like, I remember tweeting, like, back and forth with Andrew Parsons about this back when he actually watched prospects, about Marquise Lee, because we were, like, two of the original ones back in the day that was like, yeah, Lee is trash, he's bad. And one of the things that he and I, like, I remember, like, exchanging pictures about this was, like, just how unnatural and just, like, it was, like, painful to watch him, like, set defenders up and break tackles in the open field. Like, everything just took so, like, if you're watching a receiver and it just looks like everything is taking so much effort, that's a red flag. And like, he just looked like he took everything he had to do. It just looked like it took literally, like, all of his ability within him to break, like, one tackle in the open field. That's a hard thing to quantify, but at the same time, it's something that you can just see. So those are some, like, major red flags for Lee. And in general, I think that some of the most important traits is consistency. And, like, I know that sounds very vague, but if you see a guy, like, executing the same thing over and over again, like, on a routine basis, on a route-to-route basis, like, that's a good sign. It's a good sign that he'll be able to do that against NFL competition.
Right. Well, that was maybe one of the knocks on Cordero Patterson, who, I mean, you could excuse it, so it's not like, scouting reports didn't notice this and that you couldn't rationalize it away, but he would. I mean, there were moments in his Tennessee career where he actually did display good technique, maybe not refined technique, but good technique. And then the next moment, all of that would sort of go out the window.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good example of him.
You sound so depressed, man.
I honestly still don't think, like, I just wrote up dynasty rankings for wide receivers, and I'm stuck. I feel like it's an obligatory thing, like, you got to stick Cordero Patterson at the bottom. Like, he probably shouldn't even be on there, but, but it's like at the same time.
So depressed. Sorry.
But I mean, honestly, and I made the point in the article, like, I don't think we're done talking about Cordero Patterson. Like, it's just so weird.
Like, he'll go to some other team that'll know how to use him, and then we'll overhype ourselves for him.
Yeah, exactly.
And you'll have a solid wide receiver 4 career.
it could just never be like, can never be on the right track, you know? It could just never be like, all right, we're excited about this. It's like, no, we're excited about this. Draft him in the 3rd round of fantasy leagues. And I mean, that was me. Like, I was doing that. Like, why couldn't it just be like, all right, we're excited about him. We'll take a little speculative stab, you know, at some point. But no, it's always got to be like all or nothing. Yeah, whatever.
Okay, well, we'll put that right before the bit about the dog. Where can we find your dog on Twitter?
Yeah, apparently he has a Twitter account, and I will say this.
Apparently, do you not run it?
I do not run the Charlie account, and I swear to God I don't. Like I cannot make that point enough. Like people have asked me for years. Well, I guess for years now. Like because I've had him for a few years now, or not a few years, but over a year. So, anyways, they had asked me for forever, like, why doesn't Charlie have a Twitter account? Like, you tweet about him all the time. God knows you're on Twitter all the time. Like, why doesn't Charlie have a Twitter account? I'm like, because I'm not gonna make a Twitter account for my dog. I'm not a psychopath. Like, and like this account, and I tweet back and forth to each other. Like, do you guys really think that I'm sitting there? Like, I'm not. Again, I'm not a lunatic. Like, I'm not tweeting back and forth this. Just one night, the account started tweeting me, so I followed it, and I mean, it's getting pretty good. Like, whoever's running the account, and I can't. Well, I mean, whoever, it could be Charlie. I don't know. I can't confirm or deny that.
Yeah,
but
as soon as you say you're not a lunatic, you're like, well, my dog might be running the account.
But seriously, I mean, they're doing all the right things. Like, it follows one person, me. It has 102 followers, so it's @_Charlie Harmon _. Not a fan of how they have that @ structured. So right away, maybe it was a dog because it's that bad.
So it's @_Charlie
Harmon, HARMON _ So yeah, and I mean,
the end?
Huh? Yeah, the underscore at the end, right? It's weird. Okay. Like I will say he's been pretty. I don't know, like. Jim Coburn was running some like draft madness thing, which, to be honest with you, I had no idea was a thing until this Charlie account started adding me, being like, "Hey, like you got to get me votes for this," you know, because apparently Charlie's account was in there, and he almost made it to the final 4. And I never was like, "Hey guys, go vote Charlie for this." All I would do is retweet it, and Charlie beat out like he knocked out Emery Hunt. I think he knocked out. Who are some of the other ones? Oh my God, I'm looking at this page right now. There's some weird stuff going on here. He knocked out Emery Hunt. He knocked out Bill Carroll, like guys that people know on Twitter. And yeah, so he made it all the way to the final 4, and even like split it was between him and Joe Marino for the last one, and it was a 50-50. And I guess there was a recount, and Charlie almost won that, but he did eventually lose out. And I swear, like I said, I never was like, "Hey guys, go vote for my dog. Like, do this." All I would do is retweet it, and his fans would do the rest, man.
His fans. That's amazing. I know you didn't run this account. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah. There's a lot going. No, I do not run the Charlie account, and I don't know who does. I've never asked. I think that just would ruin the mystique.
Fair enough.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much for all of that. We're going to keep Matt on for just a little bit longer and talk about some news coming through, not just Vikings news, but league news, as the teams met for the competition committee, and there are a few new rules, and a notable rule is absent from the list. But we want to start first with the fact that extra points are going to stay at the 15-yard line. Arif, does this mean that our league is going to have to adjust the point total for missed extra points now?
Well, this is going to be kind of interesting because the league has been moving further and further away from like giving importance to kickers. And in fact, there's another rule in here where they make the kicker even less important because they're encouraging more touchbacks, which is, they move the touchback, I think, to the 25-yard line or something like that. Actually, I'm looking at these rules, and in fact, that's not happening, so maybe I just have bad info. But they're doing a lot to try and to try and reduce the importance of the kicker. But this actually increases the importance of the kicker and tries to and it puts more value on having a consistent kicker, which is not something the Vikings have at the moment, despite sort of the strong start Blair Walsh had to sort of the beginning of his career. So, I don't know, man.
We might have to talk about the points, maybe lowering it from -25 to something else, considering the. And I don't know if you had heard about the rules to this particular league that we have, Matt, but the Norse Code Fantasy Football League puts a penalty of -25 points for every mixed extra point.
It was brutal.
You guys shouldn't even be playing with kickers.
Yeah, but that's the whole. I mean, it's not like it's a money league.
Yeah.
Well, so it's one of those leagues that you play in to not have fun.
All games have elements of randomness to them, Matt. Jesus.
I don't.
Introducing a little bit more chaos.
If you say so.
But yeah, I don't think we should reduce. I think we should just evenly distributes the wrath and destruction. In fact, I think I got kicked out of the playoffs because of this rule. So now everyone should suffer from it.
Well, that's just fair.
Yeah. Okay, so James is having more issues with his mic, which moves us on to talk about, maybe other stuff. I think the most important or the most discussed rule, actually, was to make all chop blocks illegal. And I haven't been following this super closely. It definitely affects zone teams more than man-blocking teams, which the Vikings are now one of. They're a man-blocking team now, probably, at least, with Tony Sperano. But before, there were only some chop blocks that were made illegal. So the rule functionally is that a chop block is when a defender is engaged with an offensive lineman up high above the waist, and another offensive lineman or blocker, any kind of, could be a tight end, could be a running back, chooses to cut block or block low below the waist that player who's already engaged. It used to be those were illegal if you were cutting away from the direction of the run, and maybe like a couple of other circumstances. But there were some instances where cutting an engaged defender was totally legal, and those have been gotten rid of. A bunch of defensive players tweeted out that they're very happy about this. A bunch of offensive players tweeted out that this is awful and ruins the game or whatever. Do you have a take on this, Matt?
I think anything that makes things more standardized for the referees is important, because I think we already unfortunately, I think that the officiating already has too much of an effect on the game, and you might at first think that adding more rules or making more things illegal would do that. But I do think that, like you said, it was legal sometimes, but not legal other times. I think generally just being like, okay, all of this is illegal is probably better is better for a ref thinking, on his feet in the heat of the moment. It's probably beneficial for them. So I can tell you for a fact, like, that the league is going to do anything they can to make it appear, at least, that they are making the game safer. So, and I think this is probably a step towards that.
That's true. I've been curious about this rule. So Tyron Walker, defensive tackle for the Lions, was injured as a result of a legal chop block this last year. But for the most part, it seems like there's actually the injury risk for this kind of block is overstated. It's actually not as high. And the ones that they made illegal the year before, those evidently had a much, much higher injury rate. And some of those occurred outside the tackle box, which were not legal. Which now you don't have to determine what the tackle box is. And I think that's like a really good point about like reducing sort of the margin of error for officials. It's one of the reasons I rail about the catch rule all the time. Well, why not make it a judgment call like you do pass interference? You'd actually have a lower error rate than if you keep defining it, in my eyes, and I think a lot of officials' eyes. But I am kind of curious about this because someone mentioned that defenders would stay engaged with an offensive lineman that they're winning against when the block or the play that's called would disengage the offensive lineman and allow another blocker to legally cut this player. Now they can't because of the appearance of engagement, and it's going to make blocking that much harder. Overall, the impact of the rule is to slightly move the game even more in favor of passing the ball over running it, which, I don't know, it's kind of bothering me a little bit. What about you?
I mean, it's definitely frustrating. I do think that you'd like to at least see some teams really. I don't know. It's interesting right now because we're coming off a Super Bowl with a team that like really did buck all of the narratives about winning a Super Bowl. Like, well, you have to have a quarterback. They did not have a quarterback. You got to be good up front. Their offensive line is bad. So I mean, it's interesting about that. That
winning free agency doesn't mean you win the Super Bowl.
Right, it's another one. Yeah, you got to build through the draft, or you can bring in a bunch of good players in free agency. So that is interesting in that sense that the current Super Bowl winner, but at the same time, I think teams are very much like they want to build through the passing game and all that, and that's definitely interesting. But I'm with you that I do think that there is. I don't want to see the running game completely de-emphasized or like good, strong offensive line play de-emphasized and that sort of thing. But it seems to be the way we're going.
Yeah, fair enough. Some of these other rules don't seem all that interesting to talk about. So there's the expanding the horse collar rule. I'm totally in favor of that. So instead of if you grab the jersey at the nameplate and pull them down, that would not violate the horse collar rule. Even though like that clearly causes the same motion and causes the same problems. Technically, like the forces are a little bit different, but I think it's probably you still have the same risk of breaking someone's leg. So there's probably no controversy about that to include the jersey in the horse collar rule. Now it's a delay of game penalty when a team tries to call a timeout when it's not permitted to do so. Was that a penalty before? I thought it kind of was.
I feel like it was. It
was probably an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty.
Right.
It's just a
specific thing.
Yeah. So that's a little bit different. And now illegally touching a forward pass, #nice. Is now basically it's just treated like an incomplete pass. So you lose it down, but there's no more 5-yard penalty. That's fine, I guess. Other than that, there doesn't seem to be any like interesting rule changes. So the competition committee didn't screw things up all that much this year. Were there any rules that you saw proposed that were interesting?
Well, I mean, to me, all the discussion really, to be honest with you, I wasn't really following the competition committee rule change stuff all that much. I get kind of inundated with a lot of the dribble of it, through work. So there's some things I enjoy tuning out. This would be one of them. And I do think that it comes back to the catch rule thing for me, and just the way that the NFL has. Like the way that they chose to kind of, I'm going to be careful with how I say this, but like the tenor that they took with well, we just need to explain it to the public. It's like, I don't really think it's that complicated, but I think you're making it that complicated. And then like kind of insulting everybody's intelligence by saying that, well, the public just needs to understand it better. I'm like, I don't think that's really the problem here, but so I'm actually.
And then they reworded the rule without changing the rule this last year. And so, well, the rule hasn't changed. Just change the words for it.
Right. I should probably not even comment on this part much less.
If I continue, just in case the NFL is listening to Norse code, got you.
Yeah. If I continue to say any more, and you like somebody in the main league office happens to be a giant Vikings fan that follows you guys' podcast, it was a good run for me.
U.S. Bank Stadium is actually going to host a soccer match before it hosts a football game, which, of course, is one of the most offensive things that you could possibly do. It's also probably a demonstration that the Vikings could play soccer in this arena. They wanted a football team. They lost the bid to get to own a football team or to have that team play in its stadium. But it should be a pretty good game. It's an okay game. It's between AC Milan, currently 6th in Serie A in Italy, and Chelsea, who are the defending Premier League champions but are currently 10th in the table in the Premier League. Do you watch any soccer, Matt?
It's one of the few, and I like, this is the interesting thing about me is like I'm a quote unquote.
The one interesting thing about you.
Yeah, not many interesting things about me. Other than that, just a run-of-the-mill white dude. So one of the interesting things about me is like, despite the fact that I'm quote unquote a professional, sports writer, I don't really care for sports all that much. I love football, but I have like zero interest in any other sports. But I will say that like
you definitely look like you enjoy soccer just from your profile and.
Well, okay, I'm going to take offense to that. But I'm very sensitive, Arif. So my college roommate, I had lived with him all 4 years. He was on the soccer team, so I kind of got to know soccer, and like it's one of the few other sports that I can actually watch and enjoy. Like you couldn't pay me to watch a baseball game unless I'm there and also inebriated. So
I'm actually totally with you on that. I enjoy baseball games if I'm there.
Yeah, actually, I fell asleep once at a Major League Baseball stadium. Like, I fell asleep.
It's fine. I did too, and it was actually I was watching a Cardinals game, and I guess Cardinals fans are very into baseball.
I hear a lot of negative things about Cardinals fans that are not.
League. What are you talking?
I know there's some like best fans in baseball. I mean, like Marcus and Alex like make this joke all the time, and it goes right over my head, and I just kind of. I'm along for the ride. But no, I like soccer. It interests me. I don't know anything about like players in it, but I like watching it.
Sure. Well, evidently, two very good teams. They're probably not going to field their best sides, but two very good teams will be playing on April 12th this year, before the Vikings have the ability to play a football game there, and they will deflower the stadium. So look forward to that. Yeah, I don't know if I'm upset about this. It's just kind of like weird. So that's news. I don't really have too many takes on it. I'm sure it'll be a good game. Beyond that, there's not really any Vikings news, so we can just jump sort of into the mailbag, which definitely like this is something that it'll cover some league-wide stuff too. So you might be pseudo interested in some of this stuff. I think one of the things that's interesting to Vikings fans, Reggie Nelson hasn't signed with the team yet. The Vikings have the cap space to sign him, even though they made a couple of safety moves. I don't think it would be untoward or anything like that to sign Reggie Nelson to start. But we don't know why he hasn't signed with the team. Maybe teams aren't interested. Maybe he is just slow playing it. So the question comes from Matt Murphy. Is Reggie Nelson just waiting for Belichick to call, or for after the draft, or for what? Why do you think Reggie Nelson hasn't been signed yet?
Well, he's 32 years old, right? So I mean, he's definitely older. I think when teams get to this point in free agency, a lot of them don't mind just completely putting the brakes on it, unless. I mean, like how many guys are really going to sign between now and the draft? Teams would probably just feel better about waiting. And I think that he might fall into that category. Like I said, he's over 30 years old. He's had really good years, and like that's the surprising part. Like he was kind of a flame out in Jacksonville, but in Cincinnati, he's been been quietly one of the better safeties around recently. So to me, I do think it's odd that he hasn't been signed, but at this point, I feel like teams will probably just wait around for him, and knowing that they have like the leverage right now that many of the other teams won't move. So I think it might just be as simple as that.
No, that's pretty fair. I think a lot of this is actually, you're right. I think it's not Reggie Nelson waiting so much as just teams waiting. I know sometimes like teams will sign like free agents, I think, after the draft. Like I don't know, maybe did Seattle sign Kevin Williams after? No, they didn't. But some teams will sign free agents after the draft, and maybe there's one or two safeties. I mean, it's a weak safety class evidently in the draft. Maybe there's one or two safeties that teams covet, and if they can't get those guys, or if they find a developmental guy, they might sign Reggie Nelson and just have him start for a year or two instead. Let's see. Can we stop talking about drafting offensive line in the first round yet? Yes. That's from Tommy the Gun. Next question. Also from Tommy the Gun 13. Just got a haircut today. What is with the default of barbers to shave down the widow's peak? I have never... Really? Man, you go to some bad barbers.
I don't know
you can't
what
really
that's...
seem to comment because you don't get haircuts. You just get trims.
Well, yeah, I put a lot goes into my hair as far as the product and the time and everything.
How much time does it take you to do your hair in the morning?
Well, there's a unique process, and you actually just opened up Pandora's box again. I'm sorry.
This is fantastic. Keep going.
But so when I have very like fine hair, and I will eventually lose my hair too. Like that's going to happen within the next 10 years, I would say. Like if we're all still doing this thing in 10 years and like Twitter somehow still around, we're going to tweet about like, remember when Harmon had hair? But anyways, that's another story for another time. But So this is the best way to make your hair look good. Use whatever shampoo you want.
Oh, I'm waiting. Oh, perfect. This is what I need.
So the way I do it is gel, and I've found that paste is the best for me, and I don't know if it's the same for everybody, but paste, put that in. So okay, you get out the shower, you dry your hair. Don't blow dry your hair because that's weird. Just comb it, then put the gel in. And I have
Do you have any particular loyalty? So before we get to the gel step, do you have any particular loyalty to a shampoo or conditioner brand?
Well, I mentioned I have very fine hair, and I'm incredibly paranoid about losing my hair now. So I used to not be, but then I came out here to Los Angeles, back in July, and the first haircut I got out here, and I don't go, like I said, I don't go to any particularly fancy places because I'm not paying more than $30 for a haircut. I'm just not going to do it. I just was at like a cheap place around here, and some people will cut my hair, and they'll mention that it's a little thin. Is
it that it's naturally thin or that it's thinning?
Well, see, that's the thing. Some of them will say it's just like, because I normally end up mentioning it because it's like the one thing I'm scared about. I have a lot going. Like I have a lot riding on the hair. Like,
it's not
anyways.
that bad, man. It's not that bad, especially if you got a beard. Not that bad.
Okay, well, the point is, like, I feel like I need to be like. Okay, I'm not even going to talk about this, but so she's cutting my hair, and she mentions like it's a little thin, and she's like, "Are you worried about losing it?" And I have the thing about it is like I have bad genetics. Like both my grandfathers were bald, and it comes from the mother's side, and my mom's dad died very young and already bald. So do the math.
Oh,
yeah,
so you're gonna die young.
Well, I'm hoping not for that part. I'm hoping not for neither, but I don't think. Well, I don't know. Who knows? Arif. That's very deep. But I think that so she's cut my hair. So she mentioned that, and I was like, yeah, I've got grandfathers or whatever. She's like, well, we've got this shampoo, and I was like, and she's like, you could get 10 more years out of this. And I was like, 10 years? Take all my money. I will put that crap in my hair. Yeah. So I use a very expensive keeps your hair from.
It's like a boutique shampoo that us plebs out in Minneapolis couldn't get.
Well, it's just Nioxin or something like that.
Oh yeah, I have no idea what that is. So that must be very boutique.
Yeah, so that's what I use.
Okay. So you've got fancy stylist shampoo and conditioner. Then you step out of the shower, dry your hair, but you don't blow dry it.
Yeah, with the towel. Weird. Yeah, because it's weird. Okay. That's weird. Of all the things I'm saying right now, that's weird. But so I actually, and this is funny too. Like, I used to be very snobbish with my gel or product or whatever. But I was in the grocery store one time.
Can't imagine that.
Wow. I know, it's weird, right? So I was in the grocery store one time recently, and like I was out of gel, and the only thing that they had there was like Old Spice paste. And I was like, Old Spice paste. I was like, oh well, I'll get this and like just whatever. I used it for like a week.
It out for like the next week. Okay.
Yeah. So I used it for like a week, and it's fantastic. It's the best product I've ever had. And so that's what I'm using right now. So then put the gel in, you comb that through, and then I wait like 20 to 30 minutes. The longer, the better.
Jesus.
Recomb the hair, then put hairspray in, and then you're good to go.
That's incredible. Okay, that is quite involved. Back when I had hair, and I used to have a lot of hair, it was very luxurious. I actually also used a styling paste. So I don't want to make you feel like you're alone, or well, I do want to make you feel weird. You're weird, but I don't want to make you feel alone in using paste. I did use a styling paste for a bit.
Well, I don't feel like that's a weird thing.
It's not that weird, but it's a football podcast, so it'll seem
I'm sure
weird.
there's plenty of people that if you are looking for like a meathead football analyst, I am not your guy. There's actually one of the times we did the Fantasy Live podcast, like we do daily daps at the end where we just like dap. It could be anything like music or people. And one time I dapped Walt Whitman's poetry, and a guy actually wrote an iTunes review. Like, yeah, I had to tap out when the guy started talking about poems. So
you said this is at the end of the podcast?
Yeah. Like, wow. Yeah, you tapped out at the end of the podcast. Good job, dude. So, yeah, you really made a statement.
All right. Let's see. What is a position of need that the Vikings fans and media are overlooking? Well, outsider perspective, Matt, what do you think? You watch a little bit of Vikings games. You're kind of a Teddy fan.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. I feel like their needs are pretty straightforward. Wouldn't you say so? Like, I think they need receivers. We talked plenty about that. Like, I do think they could use an upgrade at tight end, but they're not going to probably find one in this draft, or apparently by the last few years ever again in a draft. Like, was Tyler Eifert like the last useful tight end to come out of it? You know, I guess Travis Kelce too, but like,
oh yeah.
Other than that,
it's probably it though.
It's been pretty much a disaster. So
yeah, actually, I think you actually hit one that people don't talk about. I think tight end is probably a need to the Vikings that people don't mention that much, because either Rudolph's constantly injured or he just can't replicate what he did as a rookie, which
he's not a good player.
Right, and we probably should have recognized that his rookie year was a little bit fluky because his touchdown to yard ratio was way out of whack. He had like 9 or 10 touchdowns, but he hasn't broken 500 yards yet. So I think at this point we could call it, a done deal on evaluating Rudolph. I think that a tight end is definitely something. But I think that you're right, that we don't really have a lot of options at tight end. Have you watched any tight ends in this draft?
I've watched a little bit of them, and like it seems, pretty straightforward. Like the two that I've really looked at is like I think Hunter Henry is interesting. And then Nick Vannett from Ohio State is probably the other guy that I've seen the most of. But he definitely feels like a 15 years ago tight end than what teams are looking for now.
Oh, so the Vikings are definitely drafting him then.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of like Michael Pruitt? Because there's a few people in the dynasty community that really seem to like him.
No, I'm a big fan of him, but I think that the way the Vikings are planning on using him, at least currently, will at least somewhat depress his value because they see him as like a move tight end. And he wasn't, coming out, he wasn't great at blocking or anything like that, and he doesn't look like he's built for that. But he's 6'2", so he's kind of short for a tight end, and evidently he's been picking up on blocking technique really well, according to the coaches. So they're not gonna not have him catch passes. That's what he's best at. But they're going to have him perform a variety of roles, and I think that the fact that he's going to perform a variety of roles will like depress his overall value. So yeah, if you've got Michael Pruitt as a dynasty, probably he's overvalued by some dynasty players.
Well, it sounds like it sounds like at least they'd be better off trying to nurture something out of him than investing serious draft capital in one of these tight ends this year.
Well, that answers Sports Guy 95's question, which is that Bill Simmons? Anyway, did the Vikes draft
I saw that on the question on the ledger, so I decided to kill two birds with one stone. I'm a professional, Arif.
It was very professional of you. So that answers those questions. And then we've got maybe one more football-related question. Is it wrong to feel this excited to watch an offensive line competition in training camp? I think abstractly no, but I think that maybe we'll be a little bit disappointed with this one. It's not like Matt Khalil's going away. Again, unless Andre Smith kicks out to left tackle. And I've always said this, actually. I've always said, by always, I mean as soon as the Vikings signed him this year.
So Alex Boone. 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, but 2 weeks ago. I've said this for the past 2 weeks. Alex Boone probably could have played tackle in the NFL if he wasn't drafted by the 49ers, who had Anthony Davis and Joe Staley. Aside from that he's physically capable of it, I mean, he's like 6'8".
He's very tall for a guard.
He's extremely tall for a guard. He might be the tallest guard in the league. He also has really long arms for a guard, 34.5-inch arms, very unusual. Mike Zimmer even talked about the challenges of having long arms at guard when he was talking about Mike Harris, who has 31.5-inch arms that are actually short for a tackle. And so it is kind of interesting. But, Boone played left tackle for 3 years at Ohio State. My listeners are probably tired of hearing that I mentioned that. But I think he could probably be a better left tackle than Khalil. But they're not going to give him the chance. I doubt it. I doubt they're going to give Andre Smith a chance to compete at left tackle. In which case, it's not going to be as exciting, I think, of an offensive line competition at camp than it could be, because either Phil Loadholder or Andre Smith wins at right tackle, and I think that Andre Smith is like 90% of Phil Loadholder, which isn't a knock on Andre Smith, because Phil Loadholder, when he's healthy, is like one of the top right tackles in the NFL, and I think Andre Smith matches his strengths and weaknesses perfectly, but he's just maybe not quite as good. Like they're lazy in the same ways, they're aggressive in the same ways, they have the same problems against speed rushers, they have the same issues with hand fighting, they have the same basically strength and size advantages. So that's not too exciting to me because one of them is going to win and you're going to have basically the same right tackle but healthy with good depth as opposed to last year. And then maybe the center competition will be interesting. It'll be interesting to see if Brandon Fusco, who played center for 4 years at Slippery Rock, is going to compete at center. He was a center on the depth chart in his rookie year with the Vikings. But he was obviously a very bad guard for the Vikings last year. Very good guard in 2013 and for a game in 2014 before he got injured. And then Mike Harris is probably going to win the right guard competition against Brandon Fusco. So abstractly, I don't think it's wrong to be excited about an offensive line competition. And definitely the Vikings have a lot more depth this year than they've had at the offensive line for the past several years. I don't know, it doesn't seem that exciting to me when you break it down.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of names. There's a lot of...
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting names, and I mean, if I was a Vikings fan, and I am not, I think that I would be interested. I don't know. I know I'm terrible. Well, for so many reasons, but I would definitely be excited, or I don't know, maybe excited, or definitely interested and anxious for results because
I think anxious for results. Yeah.
It's odd that their offensive line at least last year, was such a weakness because it's a team that you would think, structurally, should have a strong offensive line, and that should be a very big priority for them. So if I was a fan, I would definitely be anxious to figure out the answers here.
Yeah, and there's exciting, possibilities, right? Like Andre Smith, Alex Boone. But the thing is, so you say the stats. So 9 offensive linemen for the Vikings have started at least 16 games in the NFL. That sounds great. That sounds amazing. But then 16 of those games are TJ Clemmings. One of those guys is Matt Khalil. It's not as exciting when you break it down. 8 of those guys, they've started at least, I think, 30 games. That seems exciting. And I think the Vikings probably have some of the best depth along the offensive line in the NFL, but that doesn't mean they have a good offensive line. It just means now there's going to be less variance if an injury occurs. So that's good because those are the problem the last 2 years, but I think anxious for results and optimistic about how it's going to improve or maybe the correct reactions for me. And
Makes
I think,
sense.
And I think that's it. There's also have you guys heard Corey Feldman's music? It's really bad. No, I have not, but that is not surprising. But that's the only other question in the mailbag.
Who is Corey Feldman?
What? Haven't you watched any 80s movies ever?
No, I don't watch a lot of movies, to be honest with you.
But it's Corey Feldman. He's one of the 2 Coreys.
I'm also not, any 80s movies. I was born in 1991.
Whoa, really?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. I'm 24, Arif.
Well, there's The Lost Boys, there's Stand By Me, he was in The Goonies.
Well, I've seen the Goonies.
The Goonies.
I've seen the Goonies. All the rest of these ones. Well, I'm looking at this now. I've seen Gremlins.
Right? Look at this. Anyway, I'm not surprised his music is bad.
This is not my area of expertise. Whatever my area of expertise it is, this is not it.
Okay, well, I think that's it for the podcast. I think everybody heard it die just now, so that's pretty fair. So once again, this is Matt Harmon. He's an editor-writer for NFL.com, although we don't know for how much longer now that he has viciously insulted his employer. When he's fired from the NFL, you can find him at thebackyardbanner.com. Again, you can find him on Twitter at @MattHarmon_BYB. Presumably that stands for Backyard Banner. And you can find his dog on Twitter at _CharlieHarmon_. Once again, we really appreciate the support that you've given the show. Normally, we tell you to go to the website. That's about as finicky as James's mic right now. So instead, and these will be in the show notes like they are always, you can donate to the show either through our Patreon at patreon.com/NorseCode or through our PayPal at paypal.me/NorseCode. We really appreciate all the support you've given. It's allowed us to, store our shows in Dropbox. It's given us the bandwidth, and it's also given us, the equipment to have most of the time anyway, a pretty good sounding show. We may have to dip into those funds for James again. We'll see. And we really appreciate the support that you're giving. You can find us on iTunes. And if you haven't found us on iTunes because you followed the old show, again, it's a new RSS feed. And you can email the podcast at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. I think I hit all the basics, James, for when we close out the show. One last thing, besides another thank you to the guest. Our formula is this: keep Teddy alive.
Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.